Imagine being a Japanese soldier during World War II. You grew up in a society that values discipline, self-sacrifice, and a deep sense of honor. You were taught that the enemy, the Americans, embodied the opposite: softness, decadence, and dependence on machines. However, as the war progressed, these beliefs began to crumble, revealing the complexity of the adversary you faced. Today, we will explore how Japanese soldiers truly viewed their American counterparts and how propaganda, culture, and the brutal realities of war shaped these perceptions. The Japanese military did not leave soldiers' opinions of their enemies to chance. They were provided with manuals that proclaimed, "Read this and the war can be won." The title may sound almost comically self-assured, reminiscent of a modern self-help book. Yet within these manuals, there was more than just motivational rhetoric. They outlined how Japanese soldiers should perceive Westerners, including Americans. One section bluntly stated that Americans were cowards, while another claimed that their enemies were more afraid of combat than the Chinese soldiers they had previously fought. It suggested that Americans relied on their tanks and planes to win, but lacked the heart for battle. Initially, many soldiers likely accepted this narrative. Why wouldn't they? Early victories in places like the Philippines seemed to confirm it, as American forces retreated under pressure and Japanese troops felt invincible. However, propaganda often collides with reality, and it can lead to miscalculations. Part of the Japanese soldiers' perception of Americans was rooted not only in propaganda, but also in cultural differences. At that time, Japan was steeped in values like Bushido, the way of the warrior. Dying in battle was considered the ultimate honor, while surrender was seen as disgraceful. Discipline was the foundation of their military ethos. In contrast, Americans were perceived as loud, brash, and proud of their individualism. To the Japanese, this was baffling. Where was the discipline? Where was the respect for tradition? Moreover, Japanese soldiers viewed American creature comforts, canned food, cigarettes, and Coca-Cola as evidence of American decadence. This perception was not merely born of jealousy, it fueled a genuine sense of superiority. If Americans lived so comfortably, how could they endure the hardships of war? The Japanese high command shared this arrogance, leading to significant miscalculations. In March 1942, during a meeting to assess their progress, military leaders concluded that Americans had a high standard of living. They believed that if Americans' quality of life diminished, their morale would collapse. They genuinely thought that Americans would lack the resolve for a prolonged conflict. Pearl Harbor was not only aimed at crippling the U.S. Navy, but was also intended to shock and demoralize the American public into submission. However, the outcome was the opposite. Instead of breaking, Americans rallied, rapidly producing planes and ships at a pace Japan could not match. On the battlefield, American soldiers demonstrated toughness and resourcefulness that surprised the Japanese. One Japanese officer later admitted, "We thought we could outlast them, but their resilience surprised us." Their strength lay not just in their machines, but in their determination. Now let's turn to the front lines. Early in the war, the Japanese enjoyed a few easy victories, but then came battles at Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa, names that still evoke the horrors of war. Japanese soldiers, who once mocked American courage, found themselves facing relentless waves of Marines. A veteran from Guadalcanal recalled, "We killed so many of them, but they just kept coming. They didn't fight like we thought they would. They were very clever and adaptable." Additionally, the logistical power of the Americans was staggering. While Japanese troops were running out of ammunition and facing starvation, Americans had fresh supplies, hot meals, and medical care for their wounded. This disparity was demoralizing for Japanese soldiers. Japanese propaganda particularly targeted the U.S. Marines, portraying them as not just ruthless, but monstrous. Soldiers were told that Marines were recruited from the worst segments of American society, including prisons and mental asylums. The propaganda further claimed that Marines would kill Japanese captives, mutilate their bodies, and impale them on stakes as warnings. These tales, while exaggerated, were designed to instill terror and reinforce the resolve of Japanese troops to never surrender. One soldier later reflected, "We feared the Marines because of what we were told. They were said to be beasts, not men. We braced ourselves for monsters, not soldiers." Ironically, these exaggerated depictions often backfired. Instead of breaking morale, they heightened the anxiety of soldiers facing American forces, particularly as the brutal realities of war became evident. Japanese disdain for surrender was not merely cultural. It influenced their treatment of prisoners of war, POWs. In Japanese society, surrender was seen as dishonorable. Soldiers who surrendered were regarded as weak and unworthy of respect, even subhuman. This mindset led to the brutal treatment of captured American soldiers. During the infamous Bataan Death March, thousands of American and Filipino prisoners were beaten, starved, and killed for simply falling behind. Japanese guards viewed it as their duty to punish these dishonorable captives. One guard later reflected, "We were taught to see prisoners as animals. They were beneath us, no longer soldiers." This harsh view extended across the Pacific, where POW camps became sites of unimaginable suffering, with starvation, forced labor, and executions being routine. To Japanese soldiers, this was just another part of the war. As the conflict dragged on, Japanese soldiers began to respect their American adversaries. A striking example emerged after the Battle of Okinawa. Despite the brutal fighting, many captured Japanese soldiers were shocked by the treatment they received from Americans. An officer later noted, "They didn't kill us like we were told they would. They fed us, treated our wounds, and it was not what we expected." This grudging respect did not erase the bitterness of war, but it added complexity to how Japanese soldiers viewed Americans by the end of the conflict. As the war progressed, Japanese soldiers encountered American troops who demonstrated not only resilience in battle, but also acts of humanity that contradicted the harsh stereotypes perpetuated by wartime propaganda. Instances of American soldiers providing medical aid to wounded Japanese, offering food and water to captives, and ensuring humane treatment of prisoners challenged the preconceived notions held by many Japanese soldiers. These experiences fostered a nuanced perception, blending respect for the enemy's strength with a recognition of shared human values, even amidst the ongoing hostilities. Reflecting on these encounters, some Japanese soldiers began to question the validity of the propaganda they had been exposed to. The stark contrast between the expected barbarity and the experienced compassion led to a cognitive dissonance, prompting introspection about the nature of their adversaries. This shift in perception did not necessarily translate into camaraderie, but did pave the way for a more complex understanding of the enemy, acknowledging that valor and virtue were not exclusive to one's own side. So how did Japanese soldiers view Americans during World War II? Initially, they perceived them as weak, cowardly, and decadent. Propaganda painted the Marines as savage beasts, while American soldiers' luxuries and pragmatism were mistaken for softness. However, as the war unfolded, these views evolved, shaped by the harsh realities of combat and the undeniable strength of their enemy. This narrative underscores the perils of dehumanizing adversaries, highlighting how war can distort perceptions and lead to moral disengagement. Recognizing the shared humanity of all individuals, even in times of conflict, is essential for fostering understanding and preventing the perpetuation of violence. What are your thoughts on how societies can overcome the dehumanization of enemies during wartime? Share your insights in the comments below. For more eye-opening truths from history, don't miss our next video.